The city of Chicago in the winter of 1987 did not forgive weakness. It pressed down on everything like the sky itself had grown tired and decided to lean a little harder on the people below. The wind came off Lake Michigan with the kind of cold that did not just chill the body, but worked its way into the bones and stayed there for months. Streets turned gray before noon. Storefronts pulled their awnings in tight. And the people who lived on the south side learned generation by generation to keep their heads down and their lights on and their mouths closed about the things they saw. Sarah Whitfield had learned all of those lessons. She had learned them from her mother, who had learned them from her women who understood that survival in this part of the city was not a matter of luck, but of discipline. You rose before the sun asked you to. You worked until your hands ached. You did not complain. You did not make yourself a target. And on the nights when everything felt too heavy, you sat at the kitchen table after your child had gone to sleep, and you let yourself feel it for exactly as long as you could afford to before morning came again. Sarah was 34 years old. She had the kind of face that had once been described as beautiful and was now something better than that. It was a face that had been through things and had come out the other side with its dignity intact. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there 3 years ago. There was a steadiness in her jaw that looked like stubbornness to people who did not know her and like strength to the ones who did. She woke at 5 in the morning. She always woke at 5 in the morning. The alarm on her bedside table was unnecessary. Her body had long since trained itself to rise without being asked, as if some deeper part of her understood that every hour before the rest of the world stirred belonged to her alone. She sat up slowly in the dark, listening to the sounds of the apartment above the shop. The pipes knocking, the old radiator doing its best, the muffled press of wind against the single-pane windows that she kept meaning to replace and never quite had the money to. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, feet flat on the cold floor. Thomas used to tell her she was the only person he had ever known who woke up already thinking. Not groggy, not slow, but immediately present in measuring the day ahead like a general studying a map. He said it with admiration mostly, sometimes with a kind of gentle exasperation. She had never told him how much of that early morning thinking was simply the work of keeping fear at bay before it could get a foothold. Thomas had been gone for 3 years. She did not allow herself to linger on that thought. She had learned that too. Grief had its place and its time, and 5 in the morning when the day needed building was not it. She dressed in the dark without turning on the light, moving through the small bedroom with the practiced ease of someone who had memorized every inch of the space. The floorboard near the closet that creaked, the drawer that stuck unless you lifted it slightly before pulling. Small accommodations. The quiet negotiation of a life lived mostly alone. She pulled on her work apron in the hallway and went downstairs. The flower shop occupied the ground floor of the building at 14 Meridian Lane, a narrow 2-story structure that had been a pharmacy before Sarah and Thomas took it over 6 years ago. They had painted the exterior themselves a deep green that had faded now to something softer like old money. The wooden sign above the door read Whitfield and Bloom in letters Thomas had carved by hand over a long summer weekend, while Sarah held the baby and told him his lines were crooked. He had been right. She had been wrong. The letters were perfect. She did not look at the sign when she unlocked the front door. Inside, the shop smelled of earth and water and living things. She had arrived before any of the day's deliveries, which meant she was working from yesterday's stock. She moved to the back room where the flowers waited in their cold buckets and began. Her hands knew what to do without being asked. Strip the lower leaves, cut the stems on an angle, sort by variety, by color, by what needed water first and what could wait. It was work that required attention, but not thought the kind of work that left the mind quiet and the body occupied. And Sarah had come to value that more than she could easily explain. By 6, the front display signs were half full. By 6:30, the first arrangement for the morning's delivery was complete, a mixed seasonal bouquet for a woman on Halsted Street who had been ordering from the shop every 2 weeks for 4 years. Sarah knew without checking the card that the woman would write the same thing she always wrote. For my mother who loves yellow. She had never met the mother. She had come to feel that she knew her anyway. At 7, she went upstairs to wake Maisie. Her daughter slept the way only children can sleep completely and without reservation, as though the body understood that these years of total surrender to rest would not last and intended to make use of them while it could. Maisie was 7 years old, small for her age, but not delicate. There was nothing delicate about her. She had her father's directness and her mother's stubbornness, and a quality all her own that Sarah had never quite found a word for. A kind of attentiveness. The way Maisie looked at things, carefully, completely, as though she was storing everything away for later. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Maisie opened her eyes immediately, not gradually, just open awake already looking at her mother. "Morning," Sarah said. "Is it cold outside, very?" Maisie accepted this and sat up. On the small desk by the window, a stack of drawings sat in a neat pile secured with a rubber band. Maisie drew every day. She had been drawing every day since she was 4 years old. She drew with wax crayons, the fat kind, moving them across the paper with a seriousness that sometimes made Sarah stop whatever she was doing and just watch. The subject was almost always the same. A woman standing in a garden or behind a counter surrounded by flowers with sunlight coming in from somewhere off to the side. Always the same woman, always the flowers. Sarah had never told Maisie to draw her. She had never asked for it. But every morning the pile on the desk grew by one more sheet, and Sarah understood in the way that mothers come to understand things without words that this was how her daughter was managing the particular difficulty of their lives, capturing something that felt permanent when almost everything else did not. She made breakfast while Maisie dressed. Oatmeal with brown sugar, the same breakfast they had every weekday because the money for variety did not always stretch that far, and because Maisie did not complain. Sarah poured coffee for herself and stood at the kitchen window, drinking it while the oatmeal sat in the pot. Below Meridian Lane was beginning to stir. A man walking a dog. A delivery truck backing slowly into position 3 buildings down. The newsstand on the corner being opened by the same old man who had been opening it every morning for as long as Sarah had lived on this street. She liked this part of the morning. The city waking up. The sense of things starting rather than ending. By 8, Maisie was in her coat and boots, and Sarah was walking her the 4 blocks to school, one hand in Maisie's hand and the other carrying a paper bag with a second breakfast packed for a classmate whose family sometimes ran short midweek. She had never discussed this with Maisie. Maisie had simply told her one afternoon that her friend Marcus was hungry, and Sarah had started packing the extra bag. It was not a decision she had thought about. It was just a thing that needed doing. She watched her daughter go through the school doors. Maisie turned at the top of the steps and looked back the way she always did. A quick look, a nod, something between acknowledgement and reassurance. Then the door closed. Sarah walked back to Meridian Lane. She had approximately 11 hours before she would walk those same 4 blocks to pick Maisie up again. In those 11 hours, she needed to complete 4 delivery arrangements, accept and process 2 new orders that had been called in yesterday afternoon, restock. The front display cases reconcile last week's accounts and figure out how to stretch the remaining cash in the register through the end of the month without touching the emergency envelope she kept taped to the underside of the second shelf in the back room. The emergency envelope had been Thomas's idea. Put something in it every week, he had told her, even if it is only $5, especially if it is only $5. Because the week you need it, you will need it badly, and $5 a week adds up to things that matter. She had not touched it in 3 years. She was very close to needing to. The protection payments were 3 months overdue. This was not something Sarah spoke about out loud, even to herself. She held it the way she held most of the difficult things in her life, somewhere in the middle of her chest, compressed tightly, acknowledged, but not dwelt upon. The payments had started 8 months ago. A man named Garrett Sloan had come to the shop on a Tuesday afternoon, arriving just after a customer had left, and had sat down in the chair near the door that she kept for people waiting on orders, and had explained very calmly in the tone of someone describing something obvious and long established that businesses on this block contributed to community security. She had known what it was. Anyone who had lived on the South Side for more than 6 months knew what it was. She had also known that her choices were limited. The police in this neighborhood were either ineffective or involved. The other shop owners she had spoken to quietly in passing made clear that the payments were a fact of life on Meridian Lane. One woman who ran a laundry 3 doors down had shrugged and told her in a voice completely emptied of outrage that it had been this way since before she arrived and would likely be this way after she was gone. Sarah had paid for 5 months. Then Maisie got sick. The pneumonia had come in November, fast and serious the way things can be in children, and the doctor had been clear that the medication and the follow-up visits were not optional. Sarah had done the arithmetic standing in the hospital hallway, a pencil moving down a column of numbers in the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. The math was not complicated, it was simply brutal. She could pay for Maisie's care, or she could pay Garrett Sloan. Not both, not even close to both. She had chosen Maisie. She would always choose Maisie. Garrett Sloan had come back in January, then again in February. Each time Sarah had been honest with him, which in retrospect she recognized as either an act of integrity or an act of profound naivety, depending on how you measured those things. She told him about the medical expenses. She told him she was working to catch up. She told him she intended to pay everything owed. He had listened to her the first time with what passed for her patience, the second time with something that could no longer be called patience. The third time he had not come alone. That third visit had been 2 weeks ago. Garrett and a man she did not know, heavy-set with a tattoo on the side of his neck. She later learned was a spider, had stood in the center of her shop while Maisie was at school and made the kind of statements that were not quite threats, but were arranged in such a way that their meaning was unmistakable. The fourth visit she understood would not involve statements. She had worked since then with that knowledge sitting in the middle of her chest alongside everything else. She was working with it today. The morning passed the way mornings in the shop always passed, which was to say that it was busy and quiet at the same time, the busyness of physical work creating a kind of silence around itself. She completed the delivery arrangements. She restocked the cases. She took a new order from a woman planning a birthday party for her grandmother and spent 10 minutes discussing the relative merits of white lilies versus white roses, a conversation she had had in some form hundreds of times and that she found without irony genuinely interesting every time. She ate lunch standing at the back counter. Half a sandwich she had made that morning, a glass of water. She did the accounts while she ate the notebook open beside her plate, the numbers arranged in their columns with the precision of someone who had learned to treat every dollar as a deliberate decision rather than a passive fact. The afternoon brought 3 customers and a delivery. At 4 o'clock, she walked to the school. Maisie came out of the building moving the way she always moved, not fast but purposeful, already carrying the events of the day in her expression, processing. She fell into step beside her mother without preamble. "Mrs. Halverson says I have to redo my geography project," Maisie announced. "What was wrong with it?" "She says I put too much detail on the parts I found interesting and not enough on the parts the rubric required." Sarah looked at her daughter. "She is probably right about that," she said. Maisie considered this for half a block. "I know," she said, and that was the end of it. Back at the shop, Maisie sat at the small table in the back room doing her homework while Sarah completed the afternoon's work. This was their routine, the rhythm they had built together in the years since Thomas, a routine that had its own kind of comfort in its reliability. Maisie worked, Sarah worked. They existed in the same space without requiring anything of each other beyond presence, and the presence itself was enough. At 6, Sarah made dinner upstairs. At 7, she put Maisie in the bath. At 7:45, she sat on the edge of Maisie's bed and listened to her daughter read aloud from the library book about constellations that she had been working through for 2 weeks, taking her time with the difficult names, sounding them out, without asking for help unless she had genuinely exhausted her own attempts. Sarah watched her daughter's face as she read, the concentration in it, the small, fierce pleasure she took in getting a word right. At 8:15, Maisie was asleep. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the last of the day's coffee going cold beside her and looked at the notebook open to the monthly accounts page. The numbers had not improved since morning. She closed the notebook and went back downstairs to close up the shop. It was a task that took her 15 minutes on a normal night. She counted the register log, the total, locked the display cases, pulled the shades on the front window, checked the back door. She did these things in order methodically, the routine of it automatic enough that her mind was half elsewhere, already thinking about what she needed from the wholesaler in the morning, whether the standing order for the following week should be adjusted given the drop in walk-in traffic since the weather turned. She did not hear them come in. One moment she was alone in the back room, and then there was a sound behind her, and she turned, and Garrett Sloan was standing in the doorway between the shop floor and the back room. The man with the spider tattoo on his neck was behind him. His name, she would learn later, was Philip Wren. There was a third man she had not seen before, younger than the others, standing near the front counter with his hands in his jacket pockets. Garrett Sloan was not a large man. He was slight, actually, with the kind of thinness that looked not like health, but like efficiency, as though he had eliminated everything unnecessary from his body a long time ago. He had a scar running down his left cheek from below the eye to the jawline, a clean line that looked almost surgical in its precision. He dressed plainly. He spoke plainly. He was in his way more frightening than men who were louder or larger because there was no performance in him. He was simply an instrument of a particular kind of pressure, and the pressure was the point. "We talked about tonight," he said. Sarah had not moved from where she was standing. Her hands were at her sides. She was aware of the distance between herself and the back door. She was aware that it was not enough distance. She was aware that Maisie was upstairs and that Maisie was asleep and that the sound of this conversation was unlikely to travel through the ceiling of the old building. She was aware of all of these things at once, and she held them all quietly, and she looked at Garrett Sloan and said, "I know what I owe. I am going to pay it." "You said that in February." "I know what I said in February." Garrett Sloan stepped further into the back room. Philip Wren moved to stand near the shelves of supplies along the left wall. The young man by the front counter did not move. "My employer," Garrett said, "is no longer interested in timelines." She understood what was coming. She had understood it since they walked in. But understanding a thing and being able to stop it are not the same. And Sarah Whitfield had never been a woman who flinched from what was true simply because the truth was difficult. "Whatever you take from this register," she said, "I will need to replace it by next week." That is not me arguing with you. That is me telling you the reality of this shop so that your employer has accurate information. Garrett Sloan looked at her for a moment. "My employer," he said, "has a message that has nothing to do with the register." And then he moved. She did not go down easily. That is important to understand. She did not crumple or collapse or give way. She turned and got a hand to the shelving unit and brought 3 buckets crashing down and created enough noise and confusion that Philip Wren had to step over them to reach her. She got a foot against the wall and pushed back against the arm that was already around her shoulder. She fought with the full weight of a woman who understood that the fight itself was the message that going down without resistance was a different kind of surrender than going down having made them work for it. She fought until she could not. The blow came from the side, not from Garrett, who stepped back to let Philip do the work with the practiced efficiency of men who had divided these tasks before. The floor came up to meet her, and the smell of wet earth and cold water was the last thing clear before everything blurred at the edges and then went away entirely. She did not know how long she was unconscious. She did not know that Maisie had woken up. She did not know that her daughter had been standing in the kitchen directly above, unable to sleep, filling a glass of water at the tap when the sounds came up through the floor. Sounds that a 7-year-old girl with a mother who worked alone at night knew were wrong before she could have named why. She did not know that Maisie had stood very still at the top of the stairs for a moment listening, and then had gone back to the bedroom and put on her shoes and her coat over her pajamas with the methodical speed of a child who has decided what needs to be done. She did not know that Maisie had gone out the side door of the apartment. She did not know any of this because she was lying on the floor of the back room with flowers scattered around her unconscious and alone, while the 3 men went through the front room and took what was in the register, which turned out to be $43, and left without looking back at what they had left behind them. The night was very cold. Maisie Whitfield moved through it with the focused efficiency of someone who had made a decision and was now executing it, not wasting energy on fear, because fear had no role in the plan. She was wearing the gray coat her mother had bought 2 sizes too big, so she would grow into it, and the oversized collar came up around her ears, and in the dark, she looked smaller than she was, a slight figure, moving fast along the sidewalk with her breath making small clouds in the frozen air. She did not go to the police precinct on Ashford Street, which was 3 blocks in the other direction. She had thought about it. Standing at the top of the stairs, listening to the sounds below, she had run through the options the way her mother had taught her, not as a method of paralysis, but as a method of clarity. What can you do, and what will it actually accomplish? The police on this part of the South Side were a complicated calculation, and even at 7 years old, Maisie had been paying enough attention to the conversations between adults that she had learned this. She had learned something else too. 2 weeks ago on a Wednesday afternoon, when she had been sitting on the front step of the shop waiting for her mother to finish locking up, she had heard 2 men talking on the sidewalk outside the hardware store 3 doors down. She had not been trying to listen. She simply had good ears and the kind of quiet that made people talk as if she were not there. One man to the other, voices low. Stratton's gotten bold, pushing into the neutral blocks now. The second man quieter still. He is going to push into the wrong place eventually. The first man, there is only one name in this city that would make him think twice. The second man had said the name. Just once, just quietly. And Maisie had not recognized it, but she had stored it away because she stored everything away. She was her mother's daughter in that way. The name the second man had said was Vincent Marlowe. And the place they had said he could be found said it with a kind of caution in their voices, as if naming it required some care, was the Cardinal restaurant on West Van Buren. Maisie knew West Van Buren. She had walked past the Cardinal with her mother a handful of times, a heavy-doored place on the corner that smelled of garlic and something smoky when the kitchen exhaust was running. Her mother always walked a little faster past it. Maisie had noted this and filed it away without comment. West Van Buren was 12 blocks. Maisie started walking. She walked quickly, and she did not look uncertain because she had been taught in the indirect way that children absorb the most important lessons, that looking uncertain on the street at night invited the wrong kind of attention. She kept her head up and her pace steady and her eyes moving forward. She passed two men drinking outside a bar who watched her go without speaking. She passed a woman in a long coat who said, "Hey, honey, where is your mama?" And Maisie said, "She is just up ahead," and did not stop. She counted the blocks. At block 7, she passed a dog tied to a parking meter who lifted its head to watch her with interest and then lowered it again, satisfied that she was not a threat and also not a solution to whatever problem the dog was currently contemplating. At block 10, the wind picked up off the lake and hit her full in the face, and she pulled the collar up higher and kept walking. At block 12, she was standing in front of the Cardinal. The windows were lit from inside, warm yellow light pressing through the glass. She could hear the low murmur of conversation, the clink of dishes, something that might have been music. The door was heavy oak old, with a brass handle worn smooth from decades of hands. She pushed it open. The room stopped. Not all at once, not loudly, but in the way a room shifts when something unexpected has entered it. Conversations drew back like a tide. Heads turned. A waiter near the far wall went still with a tray in his hands. A man in a dark suit near the bar looked from Maisie to the maitre d', who was already moving toward her with an expression of controlled alarm. Maisie Whitfield did not look at any of them. She looked at the corner table. There was something about the corner table that separated it from everything else in the room without any visible marker to explain why. Perhaps it was the way the other men at other tables oriented themselves slightly toward it, the way plants orient toward light unconsciously and without intention. Perhaps it was the quality of the attention in the man who sat there. Or perhaps it was simply that he was the only person in the room who was already looking at her when she looked at him. He was a large man, not fat but dense, with the build of someone who had been physically powerful once and had simply become more so with time. He wore a dark suit with a white shirt, no tie, the collar open at the throat. His hair was mostly gray. His face was not young, but it was not old either. It was a face that had been made by decades of specific kinds of experience, the way certain tools develop their own particular character from use. His eyes were dark, and they were watching her with an expression she did not fully understand. Not curiosity exactly, not surprise. Something more like recognition, though she could not have said what he was recognizing. She walked straight to his table. The other men around it went very still. She was aware of hands moving under jackets, aware of a kind of readiness that filled the space around the corner table like a change in air pressure. She was aware of it, and she did not stop walking. She reached the table and she put both hands on his sleeve, and she looked up at him. And then she said the only thing she had been saying in her head since she came down the stairs. "They hurt my mama. She is dying." The restaurant held its breath. Vincent Marlowe looked down at the child gripping his sleeve, and something happened in his face that the men who worked for him had never seen happen before. Something behind the eyes, something old and deep and long-locked like a mechanism that had not moved in 30 years, finding the first small fraction of Gev. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask what had happened, or how she had found him, or why she had come here instead of somewhere else, somewhere more reasonable, somewhere that made more conventional sense. He was about to speak when the man to his left, a broad-shouldered figure named Dorian Bassett, who had been his right hand for the better part of 2 decades, leaned slightly forward. Dorian was a careful man, a measured man. He weighed things before he said them, which was part of why Vincent had kept him close for so long. He started to say something, some practical word, some redirection. Vincent looked at him once. Dorian settled back into his chair. "What is the address?" Vincent said. He said it to Maisie quietly, the same voice he would have used to ask for anything. Not the voice he used in this room to manage things. A different voice. One that had been put away a long time ago and was now being taken out without fanfare, without ceremony, simply because this small person in the oversized gray coat required it. Maisie said 14 Meridian Lane, and Vincent Marlowe stopped moving. Not dramatically. He did not drop anything or push back from the table or make any visible sign that the words had detonated something inside him. He simply stopped the way a mechanism stops when something essential in it catches unexpectedly. A stillness that was different from his usual stillness. A stillness that had weight in it. Meridian Lane, 14 Meridian Lane. His men noticed it. Dorian noticed it most clearly because Dorian had been there for enough years to know the things Vincent never spoke about, the landmarks of the man's interior history that had been mapped through observation rather than disclosure. Dorian knew the significance of Meridian Lane, the way you know the shape of a wound by the way someone moves around it. But nobody said anything. For exactly 3 seconds, Vincent Marlowe was somewhere else entirely. He was in 1957. He was standing in the door of a small house with the kind of terrible knowledge that arrives before understanding has caught up, the body knowing before the mind will accept it. He was 30 years younger, and the world had just finished doing something to him that it would take the rest of his life to absorb. Then he was back. He stood up from the table. To the men around him, he said nothing. He did not need to. They had worked for this man long enough to understand that the conversation was over. Whatever it had been before this child walked in, it was over now. He looked down at Maisie. She was still holding his sleeve. She had not released it once. "Can you walk 12 blocks back?" he said. "I just walked 12 blocks here," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "you did." He put his hand over hers on his sleeve, not pulling it away, just covering it, and then he walked toward the door. Maisie walked beside him. The room watched them go. Outside, the black car was already at the curb, the driver out of his seat and holding the rear door open without being asked. Dorian Bassett was right behind them, and behind Dorian, 2 other men moved with the quiet purposefulness of people who had learned to respond to Vincent's decisions without requiring explanations. During the drive, Maisie sat in the back seat beside Vincent and described what she had heard through the floor. She described it accurately and completely. In the organized way she described everything, without decoration and without omission. She described the sounds. She described the men, what she had been able to see of them through the gap in the stair railing on her way past. The man with the scar on his cheek, the man with the mark on his neck. The way they spoke to her mother. Vincent listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "You did the right thing." Maisie looked out the window at the passing city. "I know," she said. What awaited them at 14 Meridian Lane, visible through the broken front window, even before the car had fully stopped, was the particular wreckage of targeted violence, which is different from random violence in ways that someone who has seen enough of both can read like a language. Flowers across the floor, display cases open, not shattered, the register drawer extended, a chair overturned near the door. These were not the marks of anger. They were the marks of a message. Delivered, received, done with. Vincent's men moved into the shop ahead of him. He let them. He stood at the threshold for a moment, looking at the space with the analytical attention of someone assessing a scene for everything it would tell him. And it told him quite a lot because he had spent a great many years developing the ability to read spaces the way other people read text. He knew the signs of Owen Stratton's men. He had been aware of Stratton's operation for years. Stratton ran what was euphemistically referred to as community security in 3 neighborhoods on the south side, a protection structure that had been encroaching on neutral ground for the last 8 months, with the kind of gradual escalation that was designed to be too slow to demand a decisive response. Vincent had not responded to it yet because neutral ground was by design not his territory, and a man who defended territory he had not claimed was making a statement he could not then walk back. He was reconsidering that position. He moved through the front room and into the back. She was lying on her side among overturned buckets and scattered flowers, and the fact that she was breathing was the first thing he checked and the thing that determined everything that followed. Conscious moving toward it, the shallow indication of someone who had sustained a blow and was not yet through with the process of coming back. He did not know her name. He knew the shape of what had happened to her, which was more than enough to begin. He looked over his shoulder. Dorian, Dr. Aldrich, now. He looked at the other man, the car, and stayed with the girl. Maisie was in the doorway. She had not made a sound since they arrived. She was looking at her mother on the floor with an expression that Sarah would have recognized because it was her own expression wearing a child-sized face. Not panic, not hysteria. The tight and controlled look of someone absorbing something terrible through the discipline of decided composure. Vincent crossed the room and crouched down beside Sarah. He checked her pulse at the wrist. He looked at the contusion at her temple, the spread of bruising already beginning at the jaw. He had seen enough of these injuries to understand what they meant clinically, which was useful, and enough of what caused them to feel something that was useful in a completely different way. He looked up at Maisie. She is alive, he said, not kindly exactly, but directly, which was what the child needed and what he was capable of providing. She is going to stay that way. Do you understand me? Maisie said. Yes, I need you to sit with her until the doctor arrives. Can you do that? Maisie was already moving to her mother's side, already lowering herself to the floor and settling in beside her. She picked up her mother's hand and held it. Vincent stood. He stood in the wrecked back room of a flower shop on Meridian Lane and looked at a small girl holding her unconscious mother's hand, and he experienced something he had been defending himself against for 30 years with extraordinary success. He felt it simply without drama, without the apparatus of defense that usually rose to meet it. He felt it, and he did not push it away. He went to the door of the back room and made the calls that needed to be made. Dr. Aldrich, a trauma specialist who had been providing discreet medical services to Vincent's organization for 11 years and who owed Vincent more than could be conveniently counted, arrived within 20 minutes. The ambulance, arranged through the same channels, arrived 5 minutes after. Vincent rode with them to the hospital, not because he intended to. He had not made a conscious decision about it. He simply got into the ambulance when Maisie reached up from the stretcher where she was sitting beside her mother and took his hand without asking permission. He did not take his hand back. At the hospital, the corridors and the waiting and the particular fluorescence of medical buildings at night, Dr. Aldrich disappeared through a set of swinging doors with the organized energy of a man who had a job to do. An orderly brought Maisie a stuffed bear from somewhere, a small brown bear with a ribbon around its neck. She accepted it gravely. They waited. Vincent sat in a plastic chair in the family waiting area. An unusual thing for a man who had not sat in a plastic chair in a family waiting area in a very long time, if he had ever sat in one at all. Maisie sat beside him with the bear in her lap. She opened the folded crayon drawing she had been carrying in her coat pocket and looked at it for a moment, a drawing she had done that afternoon at the desk by the window. Her mother standing in the flower shop, sunlight coming in from the left. The flowers surrounding her rendered in the rough, accurate shapes that 7-year-old hands make when they know what they want to say. Maisie held the drawing out to him. He looked at it. He took it with both hands, carefully, the way you handle a thing that has more significance than its physical weight would suggest. He looked at it for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then he folded it once and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket over his chest and did not explain himself. Maisie seemed to regard this as the appropriate response. 2 hours later, Dr. Aldrich came through the swinging doors. The surgery had gone well, better than initial assessment had suggested, because the blow, while severe, had not resulted in the cranial pressure he had feared. She would need monitoring. She would have pain. She would have time to get past the pain. She was going to be fine. The word fine landed differently on Vincent Marlowe at 53 than it would have landed on him at any other age or in any other position in his life. He sat with it for a moment. He sat with it the way you sit with something that has more layers to it than the surface suggests. He arranged a private room. He arranged around-the-clock monitoring from Dr. Aldrich's most trusted nurse. He arranged security in the hall, quiet and unobtrusive, because Garrett Sloan and Philip Wren were still out there, and a job half done was a message that invited a response, and he intended to make sure no response was invited. He was in the middle of these arrangements, standing in the hallway outside the room where Sarah Whitfield was being settled into the bed that had been prepared for her when Dr. Aldrich came out and said that she was awake. Not awake the way she would be tomorrow or next week, Awake the way people are after a significant trauma surfacing slowly through layers of medication and pain, and the particular disorientation of finding the ceiling and the walls in different positions than they should be. But awake, eyes open, present. Vincent stepped into the room. Maisie was already there, already at her mother's side, her small hand finding her mother's hand on the blanket with the unerring accuracy of someone who has navigated by that particular bearing their whole life. Maisie's voice was low and steady. She was telling her mother she was okay, that they were okay, and the assurance in it was remarkable, the confidence that the situation had been managed, that the crisis had been addressed, that the world was still navigable. Sarah heard her daughter's voice before she saw anything else. Something in her body released a tension that had been there since before she felt a held thing, a breath she had been keeping for safety because Maisie's voice in the dark beside her meant the one thing that mattered most was accounted for. She turned her head. The movement cost her something. She found the ceiling. She found Maisie beside her. She found the unfamiliar room. And then in the corner, past the edge of the light from the bedside lamp, the figure of a man in a dark suit sitting very still in a chair. Not small, not unthreatening, not someone who had stumbled into this room by accident. She looked at him, he looked at her. The pain was considerable. She could feel it in specific locations and in general as a kind of total body intelligence telling her that a great deal had happened and she had not yet caught up with all of it. But pain had never stopped her from thinking, and she was thinking now. She was measuring the distance from the bed to the door. She was measuring the presence of this man against the fact of her daughter's calm. She was assembling the information available. And then she looked at him very directly and asked him two questions. In a voice that was not strong but was steady, in the way a thin wire can hold considerable weight, she said, "Who are you and what do you want from us?" The room held very still. Maisie looked at her mother and then at the man and then back at her mother, and in her daughter's face, Sarah saw something that she processed and set aside for later, the way Maisie had looked at this man in the corner. Not with the wariness of a child looking at a stranger, with something more complicated and more specific than that. The man in the corner looked at her for a moment. He did not look away. He did not offer reassurances or explanations or the softening language of someone trying to manage her reaction to their presence. He simply looked at her with the same directness she had offered him, and in his face she saw something she had not expected. Not threat, not calculation, not the particular blankness of men who have learned to feel nothing. Something older than any of those. He was about to answer when the phone in his jacket pocket rang. He took it out. He looked at the number. Something shifted in his face quickly and completely, the way weather changes in the moment before it breaks. He stood up from the chair and answered it, and she heard the voice of the man on the other end before Vincent could respond. She heard the words because they were said loudly enough that the small room offered no shelter from them. And she looked immediately to the chair beside her bed, the chair where Maisie had been sitting 1 moment ago, the chair that was now empty, the coat still draped over the back of it, the stuffed bear sitting alone on the seat with its ribbon slightly askew. Maisie was not in the room. Sarah Whitfield had been still for exactly 4 seconds before she moved. Not because she needed 4 seconds to understand what had happened. She understood immediately with the complete and terrible clarity of a mother whose body has always known where her child is, the way a compass knows north, and the knowledge that Maisie was not in the room arrived. Not as a thought, but as a physical fact, a wrongness in the air, an absence with a shape to it. The 4 seconds were because her body had taken considerable damage, and it had opinions about rapid movement that she could not entirely override. She overrode them anyway. She was sitting up and reaching for the edge of the bed when Vincent crossed the room in 3 strides and put a hand on her arm, not restraining her. Something more careful than that. The gesture of a man who understood that stopping her was not an option and was simply trying to prevent her from doing further damage to herself in the process of what she was going to do regardless. "She is not in the building," the man on the phone had said. Dorian Bassett's voice controlled in the specific way that control sounds when it is working harder than usual. "She was here 20 minutes ago. She is not here now. We are looking." Vincent said something into the phone that Sarah did not catch because she was already off the bed, already standing, already discovering that standing cost her considerably more than she had budgeted for, but that the cost was payable. The floor tilted once and then settled. She put a hand on the bedside table and waited for her vision to finish doing what it was doing, and then she was upright and functional, and that was enough. She pulled the IV line from her arm herself. Not carelessly. She held pressure on the site with 2 fingers the way someone does, who has had enough hospital time in their life to know how these things are managed. The nurse appeared in the doorway. Sarah looked at her. The nurse looked at Sarah and at the IV and at the expression on Sarah's face and made a professional assessment that some situations were not winnable on their own terms. She stepped aside. Vincent was still on the phone. He was moving toward the door, which meant Sarah fell in beside him without needing to make any decision about it. They walked out of the private room and into the corridor together, and the 2 men who had been positioned in the hall outside fell in behind them without being told. She said, "How long?" He said, 20 minutes, maybe 25. She said, "How?" He did not answer immediately. He was listening to something on the phone. Then he lowered it and looked at her and said, "The window at the end of the pediatric corridor. 3rd floor. It opens onto the fire escape." She stopped walking. He stopped because she stopped. A 7-year-old girl, she said, did not go out a 3rd-floor fire escape in the middle of the night on her own. No, he said, she did not. She looked at him, and she absorbed what that meant, and she pressed it down into the place where she kept the things that would destroy her if she let them expand too fast, and she started walking again. In the lobby, the cold air from the automatic doors hit her, and she was still in the hospital gown with her coat thrown over her shoulders, and the floor was marble, and her feet were in the paper slippers they had put on her in the room, and none of this was information that changed anything she was going to do next. She was outside before Vincent could suggest otherwise. He came out behind her. The black car was at the curb, the driver out, door open. She got in without hesitation, and he got in beside her, and the door closed, and the car was moving before any of them had spoken a further word. She looked straight ahead through the windshield at the dark city moving past. "Tell me everything you know," she said. He told her. It was not much. Dorian had been coordinating security rotations on the hospital floors, standard procedure when Vincent's people were involved in a situation with ongoing exposure. At 9:47, the man positioned near the pediatric corridor had been called to the stairwell on the west side of the building by what turned out to be a false report of a disturbance. A distraction well executed, which meant it had been prepared in advance, which meant someone with knowledge of the security arrangement had provided that information to people outside it. 4 minutes. That was the window. 4 minutes in which the pediatric corridor was unmonitored. Enough time for one frightened 7-year-old girl to disappear from a hospital room. Sarah said, "They are sending me a message." "Yes," Vincent said. "Stratton, almost certainly." She looked out the window. They were moving south through streets that thinned and quieted as the hospital district fell away behind them, headed toward the south side. She had not told the driver where to go, and Vincent had not told the driver either, and yet the car was moving in the direction she would have chosen, which told her something about this man that she noted and kept. She said, "My daughter is 7 years old." It was not a question or an accusation. It was a statement of a simple fact in a tone that meant she was holding it very carefully. It was the tone she used for the things that, if spoken differently, would come apart completely, and she could not afford for them to come apart completely. Not yet. Not until Maisie was safe. Vincent did not offer reassurance. He did not tell her it would be fine or that Maisie was safe, or any of the things that people said in these moments because they could not bear the alternative. He did not say any of that because he had lived a long time in a world that did not make promises about outcomes, and he had learned that the absence of a false promise was itself a form of respect. He said, "We are going to find her." She looked at him. He held her gaze. She looked away first, back at the window, back at the city, and in the silence that followed, she made a calculation that took approximately 4 seconds and involved every piece of information she had assembled about this man since the moment she had woken up in that hospital room and found him sitting in the corner. She said, "I need to go to the shop first." He did not ask why. He said 14 Meridian Lane to the driver. The shop looked worse in the early morning dark than it had looked in the immediate aftermath of what had happened. Damage has a way of settling into itself over the hours, becoming more definitively itself, less like something that just occurred, and more like the established state of things. The front window with its broken pane, the spilled buckets in the back room, the water having spread and then cooled into a shallow film across the floor. The register open and empty. She went in through the back door, the one that had been left unlocked when the men left, and she moved through the back room without stopping, though she registered everything she passed. She went behind the front counter. She knew exactly where she was going. The floor behind the counter was wooden old wood, the kind that had been laid down by someone who had intended the building to last a century. It had settled unevenly over the decades, and there were places where it yielded slightly underfoot. Most people who stood behind that counter never noticed it. Thomas had noticed it the second week they had the building had crouched down and pressed his thumb against it and said something she had not fully attended to at the time, something about the way old buildings hid things in plain sight. She crouched down now beside the counter and pressed her thumb against the board 2 inches from the left edge. It moved. She got her fingernails into the edge and lifted. Beneath the board was a space no larger than a shoebox packed tight between two joists. Inside the space was a large envelope sealed with tape, and beneath the envelope a small device in a protective plastic case, the kind of device that had begun appearing in the last few years, compact enough to hold in one hand. The kind Thomas had brought home once to show her, and she had asked him what he needed it for, and he had said, "I will tell you when I know more." He had never told her more. He had been dead within 8 months of that conversation. She sat on the floor of her wrecked shop with the envelope and the USB drive in her hands, and the cold coming up through the boards beneath her, and she understood with the retrospective comprehension of someone who has been handed a map after walking blind for 3 years exactly what she was holding. She opened the envelope first. Thomas's handwriting. She had not seen his handwriting in 3 years, and the sight of it did something to her chest that she did not allow herself to feel at full force. She read instead. She read quickly and completely, the way she read everything, extracting information at speed and holding it. 2 pages. Careful, organized Thomas to the end. Dates, names, figures. A description of what he had found at the transport company where he had worked as an internal finance auditor. The layers of billing and rebilling, that clean money moving through the corporate structure. The names of the accounts, the name of the man at the top of the structure whose signature appeared nowhere in the documents, but whose instructions moved through 3 intermediaries before arriving at anything that could be traced. Franklin Delaney. She had heard the name once before years ago at a dinner party they had attended early in their marriage, a colleague of Thomas's saying it in passing in the context of commercial real estate on the South Side, saying it with a particular care that she had noticed and filed away. The name of a man who existed in the city, the way certain geographical features existed as orientation points that people navigated by without examining too closely. She kept reading. Thomas had begun documenting his findings in March of 1983. He had been building a case, accumulating evidence, making copies of documents, recording conversations with the kind of methodical patience that had characterized everything he did when he believed it mattered. He had been working toward contacting the FBI. He had made initial contact with an agent named Lorne in October of 1983. He had been working with that agent slowly and carefully, giving information in increments as he verified it. In January of 1984, Thomas Whitfield had died in a construction accident at a job site on the west side of the city. He had not been anywhere near a construction job site that day. Sarah had known that. She had known it without evidence, without proof. Known it the way you know certain things about the people closest to you through the accumulated understanding of years. She had known it and had nothing to do with the knowing, no lever to pull, no authority to appeal to, no structure within which her knowledge had any operative power. She sat on the cold floor of the shop and held the papers and understood finally the full shape of what had been done to her family and why. The USB drive contained what the papers described. She did not need to open it to know that. She put the papers back in the envelope and held both items and looked at the space under the board where Thomas had placed them, where they had been waiting for 3 years with the patience of objects that have no relationship to time. And she thought about her husband at 29 years old, deciding that this was the right thing to do and doing it carefully and thoroughly, and then finding ways to come home and make dinner and help Maisie with her early learning and smile across the table in the evenings, as though the weight he was carrying had no address. She thought about that for a long moment, then she stood up. Vincent was in the doorway between the front room and the back room, not having followed her behind the counter, observing the privacy of what he understood was happening without being told. His 2 men were outside. The shop was quiet around them, that particular quiet of a place that has been disordered and is now simply disordered and still. She stood in the front room alone for a moment. She had 4 minutes while Vincent finished a call outside. She used 2 of them to find the telephone behind the counter, the one she kept for shop orders. She used the next 2 to dial the number she had memorized from Thomas's handwriting, the one written in the careful numerals of a man who expected others to be able to read them. It rang once. A careful voice answered the voice of a man who had been in the business of receiving calls at unusual hours for long enough that nothing in his tone betrayed anything about the time. She said only, "My name is Sarah Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield was my husband. I have what he was building, and I need you to be ready to receive it. Not tonight, tomorrow morning. I will call you with the address." She hung up before he could ask questions. She put the phone down. She straightened the notepad beside it. She walked to the doorway. Vincent was coming back in. He did not ask what she had been doing in the extra 4 minutes. She did not tell him. She came around the counter and stood in front of him and placed both items on the counter between them and looked at him. She said, "My daughter is missing. Stratton has her. This drive contains everything required to put Franklin Delaney in federal prison for the rest of his life. You have the reach to find Maisie tonight. I have what you need to finish this permanently. We make a deal or we do not." He looked at her. He looked at the envelope and the USB drive on the counter between them. He looked back at her face, which was bruised on the left side and still showed the careful engineering of a woman managing considerable pain through the force of will, and which did not contain anything that resembled a request. He said, "You walked out of a hospital and drove here with cracked ribs, probably in a paper gown, and you are the one setting terms." She said, "Do we have a deal or not?" Something moved in his face. Not humor, not quite. Something in the vicinity of recognition. The expression of a man encountering something he has not encountered before and finding that it recalibrates something he had thought was fixed. He picked up the USB drive. He turned it over once in his hand. He set it back down. He said, "Tell me what is on it." She told him. Organized, sequential, every detail from Thomas's notes that bore on the immediate situation. She told him about the transport company and the shell accounts, and the 3 intermediaries and the name at the end of the chain. She told him about Thomas's contact with Agent Lorne and what that contact had produced before Thomas was killed. She told him the name Franklin Delaney. His face did not change while she spoke. She was watching his face while she spoke because she had learned over 3 years of running a business alone that the face was where the real conversation happened beneath whatever words were being arranged on top of it. And what she saw in Vincent Marlowe's face when she said the name Franklin Delaney was not the recognition of a man hearing a name relevant to the current situation, but something different, something older, something that went deeper than tonight. She filed it away and did not comment on it because there was a hierarchy to the information that mattered right now, and understanding Vincent Marlowe's history with a particular name was not at the top of it. He said, "The arrangement is this. I find Maisie tonight. I remove Stratton as a problem. You give me the drive." She said no. He looked at her. "You find Maisie tonight. You remove Stratton as a problem. I keep the drive. When Delaney is handled permanently, I turn the drive over to the FBI myself." A pause. The kind of pause that functions as a measurement, as the space in which a very careful mind is running very fast through implications. He said, "You do not trust me to handle Delaney." "I do not know you well enough to trust you with anything yet," she said. "What I know is that this drive is my husband's work and my daughter's safety, and the reason my family has been targeted for 3 years, and it does not leave my hands until it goes where Thomas intended it to go. Into the hands of federal law enforcement, not as a contingency or a backup plan or a secondary option, but as the primary method of resolution. That is not a negotiating position. That is what is true." Another pause. Longer. Then something in him shifted in the way that a decision settles into a person's posture, a slight adjustment, a resolution of tension into intent. "We have a deal," he said. She nodded once. She put the envelope inside her coat against her side, and she put the USB drive in the pocket of the coat, and she turned toward the door. He said, "I am going to need to make some calls." She said, "Make them in the car." She was already walking. Before they left the building, Vincent paused at the door and made a brief call. It lasted 11 seconds. When it ended, he said nothing about the call, and Sarah did not ask. But the call had been made, and the name Garrett Sloan had been spoken into it, and the name Philip Wren had followed, and the address of a bar on the east side of the neighborhood had been given at the end. Some things did not require explanation to be understood. An hour later, while they were waiting in the car for word on Maisie's location, his phone buzzed once with a text message he read and set face down on the seat. She said Sloan and Wren. He said they will not be a problem. She said, are they alive? He looked at her. She said, I need to know. He said they are in a position to reflect on their choices. Whether that reflection produces anything useful is between them and whatever they believe in. She accepted this. She had asked the question she needed to ask. The answer was sufficient for the purposes of what she was carrying forward. The next 2 hours were the longest Sarah Whitfield had ever spent inside the confines of her own patience. She sat in the back of the car on a side street 3 blocks from the hospital, while Vincent worked the phone with the methodical efficiency of a man deploying an organization that had been built over decades precisely for the purpose of knowing where things were and making them move. She listened to his end of the calls and built what she could of a picture from the half she heard. People being roused and directed. The particular geography of Stratton's operation being mapped and assessed. Contacts being activated. Debts being called in the complex economy of obligation that sustained this world being converted into something useful. She did not find the world he operated in surprising. She had lived on the South Side for 6 years. She had paid protection money for 5 months. She had a daughter who had walked 12 blocks in the dark to find the most dangerous man in the city. She had long since moved past the luxury of being surprised by the mechanisms of power. What she found sitting in the back of that car was that the mechanisms could be repurposed, that the same structures that had been used to take Maisie could be used to find her. That power was not inherently anything. It was a tool with a direction, and the direction was a choice. Thomas had tried to use the law as his tool. The law had taken too long. She was making a different choice about the speed, but not about where it ended. At 12:15 in the morning, Vincent lowered his phone and looked at her and said, there is a problem. She had been expecting this. Not this specific problem, but a problem. Because nothing in the last several hours had run cleanly, and there was no particular reason to expect that to change. He said the information about the hospital, the room number, the floor, the security rotation, that information came from inside. She looked at him. He said, I have 5 people who knew the full arrangement. I have been going through the logic of who could have communicated it and in what window, and the answer is one person. She waited. Dorian Bassett, he said. She had heard the name. She had heard it in the car earlier when Vincent was on the phone, heard it with a particular kind of attention she gave to names that seemed to carry weight. The broad-shouldered man from the Cardinal who had started to say something at the table and had been stopped with a single look. Vincent's right hand, 18 years. She watched his face while he said the name, and she understood from what she saw there that this information cost him something real. Not surprise exactly. She thought he might have been in the process of suspecting it before he confirmed it, that the confirmation was the arrival of a thing already dreaded rather than a thing unknown. But the cost was real regardless. 18 years was 18 years. Loyalty was what made the world make sense, and betrayal was what unmade it, and a man like this she thought would feel that unmaking very deeply, even if he never said so. She said, do you know why? He said, not yet. She said, before you do whatever you are thinking of doing, I would like to know why. He looked at her. She said, because there is always a reason, and the reason changes what it means. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and made a call that lasted 40 seconds and consisted mostly of instructions with a few short answers from the other end. When he hung up, he said, I will know more in 20 minutes. 18 minutes later, a name. Franklin Delaney's organization had been holding Dorian Bassett's son since September. A young man named Curtis Bassett, 22 years old, held in a location in Detroit under circumstances that had been made very clear to his father. Cooperate and be silent, or the situation in Detroit became permanent. Dorian Bassett had carried that for 4 months. 4 months of sitting at the right hand of the most powerful man he knew, of watching the situation in which he had placed himself, of calculating and recalculating whether there was any way to resolve it that did not require him to betray the man he had served for nearly 2 decades. 4 months of finding every time that there was not. Vincent received this information sitting completely still in the front seat, which he had moved to when Dorian's name came up, as if the physical separation of the front and back of the car was a way of creating some small, manageable distance from the implications. He held the phone in his hand after the call ended and looked at the street ahead. Sarah said, "He did not have a choice." Vincent said nothing. She said, "I am not arguing that it was right. I am saying he did not have a choice. There is a difference. A man protecting his child is not the same as a man who chose to betray you." Vincent looked at the street. She said, "Free the boy. That is part of the arrangement." He turned and looked at her over the seat back. She held his gaze without qualification. She said, "Whatever you were going to do about Dorian, this is what I am asking instead. Find Curtis Bassett in Detroit and bring him home. Dorian did what any father would do. You know that is true." The silence in the car was the specific silence of a man examining something he had already felt and had not yet decided whether to admit to feeling. He turned back to face forward. He picked up the phone. He said 3 sentences. The third sentence contained a name and a city and an instruction that was delivered in the tone of a man who has moved a piece from one place on a board to another finally and without equivocation. He put the phone down. He did not say anything about Dorian Bassett, and Sarah did not push him. She understood the geometry of what he was managing, and she understood that some of it had no language for it, that the territory between what was right and what was bearable in that situation was not mappable in words, and that trying to make it so would reduce it to something smaller than it was. She said, "Where is Maisie?" He said, "We are going to know within the hour." She nodded. She looked out the window. She took the USB drive from her pocket and held it in her hand. She thought about Thomas at the kitchen table 3 years before he died, the way he used to sit at the end of the day with his hands around a coffee cup and his eyes somewhere else working through something in his head that he would not bring to her because he was trying to protect her from it, which was a form of love she had accepted at the time without fully understanding its cost. She thought about what it had cost him. She thought about what it had cost her. 3 years of building and maintaining a life on the foundation of incomplete information, of feeling something wrong at the edges of what she had been told about his death, without having the solid ground of fact beneath her to stand on. She had that ground now. She turned the USB drive over in her hand. Thomas had done everything right. He had documented methodically. He had found the right person in the FBI. He had hidden the evidence where it would be safe. He had done it all with the careful patience of a man who loved his family and loved what was right, and believed those two things could coexist, could be held together, could both be served. He had been killed before he could finish. She was going to finish it. At 1:40 in the morning, Vincent received a call. He listened for 30 seconds, looked at her, said Stratton is holding her at a warehouse near the South Canal, 3rd building past the rail crossing. There is a man on the east entrance and 2 more inside. She had already reached for the door handle. He said, "Sarah." She stopped. He said, "I need you to let me handle the extraction. Not because you cannot manage it, because if you walk into that building in the state you are in and something goes wrong, Maisie loses the only parent she has left." The words landed. She held the door handle. She knew he was right, not because she could not function. She had been functioning at a remarkable level for the last 3 hours, given the available information, but because the variables were not in her control and the risk distribution was wrong. She was one person with a bruised skull and 3 cracked ribs and no operational knowledge of the building. She was also the only thing standing between Maisie and the category of outcome she refused to let her mind settle on. The calculus was clear. She took her hand off the door handle. He made 2 more calls. While he made them, she sat and did the thing she was worst at in the world and best at by necessity, which was waiting with full intelligence and zero ability to act. She thought about the first morning after Thomas died. She had been in the hospital for a day and a half, and when she came home, the apartment was the same as it had been, and Maisie was at her sister's, and the silence of the place was total. She had stood in the kitchen for a long time. She had looked at everything that was still where he had placed it. She had understood that the project of surviving the next several decades without him was going to require the same discipline that building the shop had required. One thing, then the next thing. The feeling could not be the enemy of the action, or nothing would get done. One thing, then the next thing. At 2:15, Vincent's phone rang. He answered and listened and said only the name of the street they needed, and the driver already knew the number. and the black car pulled away from the curb and accelerated into the empty streets. They drove in silence. She was holding the USB drive in her hand inside her pocket, and she was looking at the city moving past, and she was doing a very precise thing with her attention, directing it entirely forward, entirely toward the next thing, because the alternative was to let it reach backward or sideways, and neither of those directions was available to her right now. At 2:22 in the morning, she was standing outside a warehouse near the South Canal, with the cold hitting her hard from the direction of the water, and the sounds of the city compressed and distant, and the world contracted to the specific geometry of the building in front of her, and the knowledge that Maisie was inside it. Vincent had sent his men ahead by 4 minutes. He was standing beside her. She said, "How long?" He looked at the building, at the positions of the lights, at the things she did not know how to read that he was reading. He said 5 minutes. She counted the seconds. She had always been able to count seconds accurately, a skill she had acquired by accident in the years of waiting for test results in hospitals, for news of various kinds, for the specific resolutions of specific anxieties that required waiting and could not be accelerated. She had learned to count because it gave the waiting a structure. She counted. At 4 minutes and 40 seconds, there was a sound from inside the building. Not loud, the sound of a door. At 4 minutes and 50 seconds, the side entrance opened. At 4 minutes and 53 seconds, a man emerged carrying a small figure, and Sarah was already moving before the figure had fully resolved in the dark into the specific dimensions in the specific gray coat and the specific face of her daughter. Maisie Whitfield is conscious and unhurt, and her first word when she saw her mother coming across the gravel toward her was not "Mama." And it was not a question, and it was not the sound of a child who has been frightened. It was, "I knew you were coming." Sarah took her daughter from the man carrying her and wrapped both arms around her and held her. And Maisie pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, and that was all. That was the complete thing. Everything else that needed to happen, would happen, had already been set in motion, was in the process of its own resolution, at this moment and in the minutes ahead. But this was the center of it. This was what all the rest had been structured to produce. She held her daughter. She stood in the cold at the edge of the South Canal, with the city pressing in from all sides, and she held her daughter and she let herself feel it, all of it, just for that moment. The fear that had been compressed and managed and set aside for the last several hours, releasing all at once, moving through her and then past her, leaving her on the other side of it. Still standing, still here, still the thing between Maisie and the world. When she looked up, Vincent was standing a few feet away. He was not looking at them. He was looking at the building, at the work being finished, the practical and difficult work of the world he operated in. But there was something in the angle of his posture that she recognized, a deliberate orientation away from them, as if the scene of a mother holding a recovered child was a thing he could not look at directly and had decided to respect by not trying to. She looked at him for a moment. She tightened her arms around Maisie once. Then she set her daughter down and took her hand and looked at Vincent. She said, "There is something you need to know about Delaney, about his family, about Meridian Lane." He went very still. She said, "Not here, but before anything else happens, you need to hear it." She looked at him, and in the specific dark of the South Side in the winter of 1987, with her daughter's hand in her hand and her husband's life's work in her pocket, and the weight of everything that had happened and everything that still needed to happen, she looked at Vincent Marlowe with the clear eyes of a woman who has been through the worst of something and is still standing and has things left to do. He looked back at her. Neither of them looked away. They did not go back to the hospital. Sarah made that decision in the car on the way away from the canal, quietly and without announcement, the way she made most decisions, by running the available options against the available facts and arriving at the one that made the most sense given everything she knew. The hospital was a known location. It had already been compromised once tonight. Maisie was unhurt. Sarah was functional, which was a generous word for her current physical state, but an accurate one. The priority was not comfort. The priority was control ground. Vincent had a building on the west side that served as a secondary office, a place he used when the cardinal was not appropriate for the nature of what was being discussed. It was clean and heated and had a room with a couch where Maisie could sleep, and it was known to a limited number of people, none of whom had any connection to Owen Stratton or Franklin Delaney that Vincent had not already accounted for. He offered it. Sarah accepted. Before they left, Vincent came to the doorway of the car. He folded a piece of paper once and placed it in the outside pocket of Sarah's coat, which was draped over the seat beside her. She saw him do it. She did not open it until later, until she was standing alone in the flower shop the following afternoon. She let it sit in the pocket for now without comment. Maisie fell asleep on the couch within 6 minutes of lying down, still in her coat, still in her shoes, one arm around the stuffed bear she had somehow kept hold of through everything. Sarah stood in the doorway of the room and looked at her daughter sleeping and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite prayer and not quite gratitude, but occupied the same space in the body as both. Then she pulled the door almost closed and went to find Vincent. He was in the main room, standing at the window looking at the street below. He had taken off his jacket and was in his shirt sleeves. There was a coffee pot on the table that one of his men had produced without being asked, and 2 cups, and Sarah sat down at the table and poured one and held it in both hands and let the warmth work on her fingers. He turned from the window. He came and sat across from her. She put the USB drive on the table between them, and then she opened her coat and took out the envelope and placed it beside the drive. She smoothed the envelope once with the flat of her hand. She said, "I am going to tell you everything that is in here, all of it, because some of it concerns you directly, and you have the right to hear it before anything else happens tonight." He did not move his gaze from her face. She told him. She told him about Thomas in the transport company and the 14 months of documentation. She told him about the shell accounts in the 3 intermediaries and the name that sat at the end of the chain like a stone at the bottom of a well. She told him about Agent Lorne and the careful, incremental transfer of information that Thomas had been managing in the last year of his life and the way it had been stopped. She told him about the land. She told him about the deed in the back of the USB file, a document Thomas had found in the county records and copied because it appeared in the same ownership chain as the transport company's real estate holdings. A parcel on Meridian Lane, 1954, Harold Delaney grantee. The purchase recorded in the county clerk's office 3 years before Ann Marlowe died on that same street. Harold Delaney had bought it, had tried to develop it, had found that the presence of a particular man 2 doors down made certain plans impossible, and had resolved the problem the only way men in his position resolved problems. Franklin Delaney had inherited the land and the business, and apparently the method. For 30 years, those consequences had been sitting in the same place in Vincent Marlowe's chest without ever having had a cause attached to them. He sat very still while she told him this part. She watched his face, and she understood that she was watching a man receive the answer to a question he had stopped asking, because unanswered questions of that magnitude become over decades simply a feature of the landscape. You stop looking at them directly. You navigate around them. You build your life in reference to them without examining them. And then someone sits across from you in a room at 3 in the morning and hands you the answer in plain language, and the landscape changes all at once. He said nothing for the long time after she stopped speaking. She did not fill the silence. She understood that the silence was not empty. It was full of 30 years being reorganized around a new understanding, and that was not a process that could be hurried or that needed commentary. Finally, he said, "Anne," just her name, just that. Sarah said, "I am sorry." He looked at the table. He said, "A piece of land." She said, "Yes." He said, 30 years, my wife. Because of a piece of land. She said, "Because of what your presence on that land prevented, what you would have built there, what Harold Delaney wanted to build instead and could not while you were there. His son inherited everything." Vincent looked at the USB drive on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at her and said, "What do you need from me to finish this?" He had accepted it, not neatly, not without cost, but he had accepted it the way a man accepts the final shape of something he cannot change, which is different from resignation and different from peace, but contains something of both. She had been ready for this question. She said, "I need Stratton handled, not killed, removed. Enough leverage that he cooperates with the federal case against Delaney. He is a smaller piece, but he is a piece that can be used." Vincent nodded. He said, "That I can do." She said, "I need you to let the FBI case move without interference. The drive goes to Lorne this morning. The case Thomas built goes where Thomas intended it to go." He looked at her. He said, "The system takes time. Delaney has lawyers and connections, and he has been insulating himself from exposure for 30 years. She said, "I know that." He said, "Months, possibly longer." She said, "I know that too." Thomas understood that when he started. He was building something that would hold up in a courtroom, not something that would resolve in a night. The difference between what you do and what the law does is that what the law does stays done. A pause. She said, I am not asking you to like it. I am asking you to let it happen. He was quiet for a moment. He said, and Delaney himself. In the period before the case resolves. She said, no one touches Delaney. That is also part of what I am asking. He looked at her with an expression that was not simple. It was the expression of a man who had spent 30 years with a particular debt on his ledger, a debt of the kind that does not diminish or become negotiable with time, and was being asked to hand the resolution of that debt to an institution he had never had particular cause to trust. She held his gaze. She said, I know what I am asking. He said, I am not sure you do. She said, you loved her for 30 years after she was gone. You built everything you built in the shadow of what happened to her. If you handle Delaney your way, it ends in a week, and it is over, and it is dark, and it is secret, and it changes nothing about the city or the structure that allowed it, or the next Franklin Delaney who will come along in 10 years because nothing was ever made visible. Thomas died to make it visible. I need it to be visible. The room was very quiet. Outside, the street was empty. At this hour, the city in the thin, silent territory between the end of late night and the beginning of early morning. Vincent Marlowe looked at a woman with a bruised face and cracked ribs who had gotten out of a hospital bed and recovered her daughter and was now sitting across from him, asking him to exercise a restraint he had not exercised toward anyone in 3 decades. He said, you are going to give me your word that this happens, that the drive goes to Lorne and the case moves. She said, I have been intending to do this since before I met you. You are not the variable in that equation. Another pause. He said, all right. She said, all right. She picked up the USB drive and closed her hand around it. She said, there is one more thing. He waited. She said, Dorian. He was still. She said, whatever you are holding, I am asking you to put it down. He had 4 months of impossible. He made the choice any father would make. You just sent people to bring his son home. Let that be how it ends. He looked at the table for a long moment. He said, 18 years. She said, I know. He said, he put Maisie in that building. She said he put her somewhere she could be found. He did not put her somewhere she would not come back from. There is a difference. He made certain there was a difference. Vincent was silent. She said, you know that is true. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, he is out of the organization. That is not negotiable. She said, that is fair. He said, but he goes with his son. She understood what he meant. He goes intact. He goes alive and with his family, and with the implicit protection of a man who has decided that the debt is settled. She said yes. He nodded once. She finished her coffee. At 4:15 in the morning, Sarah Whitfield made a second call from a telephone in the back hallway of the building. She dialed the same number she had called from the flower shop 4 hours earlier. Agent Lorne answered on the second ring. She said, it is Sarah Whitfield again. I need to meet you today. I have the USB drive and the full documented file. I also have a cooperating witness I can deliver within the next 48 hours. And I will have someone with me who has operational information the case will need. Lorne said, where? She gave him the address of a coffee shop on the north side of the city, far enough from the south side to be neutral ground. He said 9 o'clock. She said 9 o'clock. She ended the call. She stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone in her hand. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him specifically in precisely the way she allowed herself to think about him on mornings when the day's work had not yet started. She thought about what it had cost him and what he had intended and what she was holding now at this table that was the residue of what he had done. She thought you finished it. She thought we finished it. She put the phone down and went back to check on Maisie. Her daughter was still asleep. She stood in the doorway and watched the small rise and fall of Maisie's breathing and felt the day that had just passed and the day that was coming begin to arrange themselves into something she could carry forward. Not easily, not without cost, but forward, which was the only direction that had ever been available. She went back to the main room. Vincent was no longer at the table. He was standing at the window again. She had the impression he had been standing there most of the time she was on the phone, not the impression of a man at rest, but of a man in process, working through something at the pace it required. She said 9 o'clock this morning, the coffee shop on Wabash. I am giving Lorne the drive. He did not turn from the window. He said, I know a name, a judge. someone Delaney cannot reach. If the case needs a place to land where it will not get buried, this is the person. She said, give it to Lauren when I make the introduction. He turned then. He said, you are going to introduce us. She said, you have information about Delaney's operations that the federal case will need and that Thomas did not have. You also have Stratton, who I am going to need you to deliver to Lauren's office by tomorrow morning. If you are providing those things, you should be at the table. He looked at her for a moment. She said, I am not asking you to become someone you are not. I am asking you to do what you are going to do anyway, in a way that serves something larger. He was quiet. Then he said, you are a very unusual person, Sarah Whitfield. She said, I am a woman who has been trying to keep a flower shop running for 3 years. I am not unusual. I am just paying attention. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. She sat back down at the table. She said, tell me about Anne. He turned back to the window, and she thought for a moment that he was not going to answer, that the question had gone into the particular silence he used as a door against things that could not be let in without cost. But then he began to talk. Slowly at first, the way a thing begins that has not been done in a very long time and needs to find its rhythm. He talked about her the way people talk about the dead they loved when they have finally found someone who will hear it without requiring them to be finished with it. Not past tense, not with the careful distance of established grief. Just about her, who she was, the way she thought, the things she found funny, the plans they had made, the specific plans, the names for the children they had talked about, the house they had argued over in a good-natured way that had never been resolved because the argument itself was something they enjoyed and there was no hurry. Sarah listened. She did not offer anything in return. That was not what was required. What was required was simple, and she was capable of it. She listened to a man talk about his wife, and she heard him, and the hearing was enough. When he was done, there was a silence of a different kind, lighter. The silence after something has been put down rather than the silence of something being held. He said, she would have liked you. Sarah said, I would have liked her. He looked at her. She held his gaze without qualification. The morning came in the way winter mornings came in Chicago, without ceremony or warmth. Simply an increment of gray light pressing at the edges of the windows until the dark conceded. By 7, the street below was beginning to fill. By 7:30, Maisie was awake and had been given breakfast by someone in the building's small kitchen and was sitting at the table drawing in the notebook that appeared to have been produced from the same mysterious source as the stuffed bear and the breakfast. She was drawing the flower shop, not as it had been left the night before, as it was on any ordinary morning. The display cases full, the light coming in from the east window, her mother behind the counter with her hands doing the work that her hands always did. Sarah stood at Maisie's shoulder and looked at the drawing. She said, that is exactly right. Maisie said, I know. At 8:45, Sarah and Vincent were in the car heading north on Wabash. Maisie was with the driver, parked half a block from the coffee shop, in possession of her notebook and a hot chocolate that had been acquired at the corner stand without drama. She had pointed out with complete logic that she was not staying anywhere without her mother for the remainder of this day. Sarah had explained that the meeting would be boring. Maisie had said she was aware of that. Sarah had said stay in the car. Maisie had stayed in the car. The coffee shop was small and warm and smelled of burned coffee and old wood, a neighborhood place that had been on the same corner for 30 years and showed it. Agent Lauren was already there when they arrived, a compact man in his mid-50s with the kind of face that practiced invisibility, the face of someone who had spent a career being in rooms without being noticed. He was drinking coffee. He looked at Sarah when she walked in, and something moved through his expression, a recognition that went beyond the surface of the meeting, the recognition of a man who had been waiting for this and had not been certain it would come. He looked at Vincent and did not quite manage to hide his surprise. Sarah said, he is here because he has information the case needs, and because he is delivering Owen Stratton to your office tomorrow morning. Lauren said, Mr. Marlowe. Vincent said, Agent Lauren. A pause in which 30 years of opposing cosmologies briefly occupied the same small table. Then Lauren looked back at Sarah and said, may I see it? She placed the USB drive on the table. She placed the envelope beside it. She said, the drive contains 14 months of documented financial transactions, recorded communications, and a complete organizational chart of the billing structure used to launder revenue through Delaney's transport companies. The envelope contains my husband's written record of the investigation and the circumstances of his death. There is also an audio recording. She paused. She said, "The recording contains a voice giving a direct order. You will be able to identify the voice." Lauren picked up the drive carefully, the way people pick up things they have been looking for a long time. He said Thomas was one of the most careful people I have ever worked with. He built something that is going to hold. She said, "I know." He looked at her. He said, "I am sorry it took this long to get here." She said, "Get it right. That is all I am asking." The meeting lasted 2 hours. What was established in those 2 hours was a sequencing of events, a structure for the delivery of evidence, a plan for the use of Stratton as a cooperating witness, a timeline for the filing of charges, and a set of interim protective arrangements that Lauren could authorize through channels that Delaney could not easily reach. Vincent provided 3 separate pieces of operational information about Delaney's current business structure that filled gaps in Thomas's documentation. He provided them without being asked for anything in return. He provided them the way a man does who has finally found the correct address for something he has been carrying for a long time. He also provided the name of the judge. Lauren wrote it down without commenting on the source. At 11 it was done. They walked out into the cold white morning and stood on the sidewalk with the city running its ordinary business around them. Maisie was in the car at the end of the block. Sarah could see her through the window, the notebook open on her knee, the crayon moving with its usual seriousness. Sarah said, "Can we go home now?" She was saying it to no one in particular, or perhaps to herself, or perhaps to Thomas somewhere in the architecture of the morning. They went home. Home was the apartment above the flower shop on 14 Meridian Lane, which was still in the state that the previous night had left it. Sarah stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at it with the eyes of a woman who had been looking at problems for long enough to see them primarily as sequences of tasks. She said to Maisie, "Go upstairs. Start a bath." Maisie went upstairs without argument, which was itself a measure of how much the last 16 hours had taken from her. Sarah stood alone in the shop. She looked at the broken window, the overturned displays, the floor that needed cleaning, and the register that needed replacing, and the door frame that needed repairing. She put her hands in her pockets. She found the folded note she had watched Vincent place there before they left his building. She took it out. It was a piece of paper folded in thirds, and when she unfolded it, she recognized his handwriting, which was precise and economical like the man himself. It read, "The building is yours. What it needs has been arranged. Do not argue with me about this." She stood there. She read it twice. She thought about arguing with him about it anyway on principle because she was not accustomed to receiving things without a clear accounting of what was owed in return. She thought about what he would say if she tried. She thought about whether she actually wanted to spend energy on that argument or whether she wanted to spend energy on other things. She folded the note and put it back in her pocket. She went upstairs. 3 weeks later, Agent Lauren called. She was behind the counter when the phone rang. The shop newly reopened around her, the window replaced, the display cases restocked, the floor cleaned, and the register new. Lauren said, "It is moving, faster than I expected. The audio recording is very clear. The financial documentation is airtight. Stratton has been fully cooperative. There are 3 assistant U.S. attorneys who have been waiting for this kind of case for years." She said, "How long until charges are filed?" He said, 6 weeks, possibly less. She said, "Good." He said, "Sarah, your husband was right to trust the process, and you were right to finish it." She said, "Thank you, Agent Lauren." She put the phone down. She went back to arranging the morning's delivery bouquets. The charges were filed in early January. Franklin Delaney was arrested on a Thursday morning outside the restaurant he had lunch at every Thursday for 20 years, a routine that had always been, until that Thursday, his undisturbed prerogative as a man who believed himself untouchable. Lauren called her as it was happening. He said, "It is done." He was taken at 11:47 this morning. Federal custody, no bail hearing until next month at the earliest, and the judge is the one you know about. She said, "Was he surprised?" Lauren said he was eating lunch. A man who has eaten the same lunch at the same table every Thursday for 20 years. She said, "Good." She put the phone down. She stood behind the counter of her rebuilt shop on Meridian Lane with her hands flat on the glass case, and she looked at the flowers arranged in the cold display, the whites and the yellows and the deep winter reds, and she thought about a man who had been making the same choices for 30 years and had finally arrived at a Thursday morning on a public sidewalk in handcuffs. She thought about Thomas. she said quietly to no one in the room. It held. She straightened an arrangement in the nearest case. She went back to work. The shop had been rebuilt in the second week of January with help that arrived without introduction. A man who showed up on a Monday morning and did the work and left without presenting a bill, which Sarah recorded as a debt she intended to settle in some form to be determined. She had repainted the front exterior herself over a weekend, a slightly different shade of green than before. Not dramatically different, not a statement, just a small adjustment, the kind you make when something has changed and the surface should reflect that without making a performance of it. The sign above the door still read Whitfield in Bloom. She had considered changing it and had decided against it. Thomas had carved those letters. They were exactly right. They did not need to change. On the first Tuesday after the reopening at 7:15 in the evening, after Maisie had been put to bed and the shop was closed and the day's work was done, there was a knock at the front door. She was in the back room. She knew who it was before she answered it. She had been expecting it not in the sense that she had been told to expect it, but in the sense that she had come to understand something about this man over the weeks since the canal and the coffee shop and the note in her pocket, something about the quality of his presence in the ongoing situation, the way he had organized things and stepped back from them, never requiring acknowledgement, never appearing in a way that demanded to be managed. She opened the door. He was standing on the step in the cold no car at the curb, which meant he had walked. A man who arrives in a car arrives as a presence that is framed and announced. A man who walks arrives as himself. He had a paper bag in one hand. She looked at the bag. He said coffee, from the place on Van Buren that is still open at this hour. She stepped back from the door. He came in. They sat at the small table in the back room, the one Maisie used for her homework, with the coffee between them in paper cups. The shop was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a place that is clean and closed and ready for tomorrow. The cold pressed at the repaired window but did not get through. She said, Dorian. He said, his son is home. They are in Cincinnati. He has work. They are all right. She said, good. He said, the case is moving. She said, Lauren called yesterday. He expects the charges to hold. He nodded. There was a silence that was comfortable in the way silences are between people who have been through the same particular experience and do not require the experience to be narrated back to them. She said, Maisie drew a picture of you. He looked up. She said, she draws every day. There is a new one from this week. You are in it. He said, what am I doing in it? She said, standing next to the shop. In your suit. She drew the buttons on the jacket. She put a lot of work into the buttons. Something moved behind his eyes, the same quality she had noticed since the first night, that old lock thing, with a little more movement in it each time she saw him. He said, she is remarkable. She said, she is her father's daughter. She is also mine, which means she is going to be a great deal of trouble for the foreseeable future. He made a sound that had arrived finally at being a real laugh. Not in the neighborhood of one. The thing itself, it surprised him, she thought, as much as it surprised her. As if it had been waiting for the right conditions and had simply come forward when they presented themselves. She held her coffee. She said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the asking does not come with any expectation. He said, ask it. She said, what do you do now with the rest of it? He considered this. He said, there is a youth program in the 4th Ward. They need a building. I have been thinking about the building on Meridian Lane, the property 2 doors down from here that has been empty for 3 years. She looked at him. He said, a place for children from this neighborhood to go after school. Tutoring, a library, the kind of thing that this part of the city has not had because nobody with resources has cared to put them here. She said, who decides what goes in it? He said, I thought perhaps someone who understands this neighborhood and has a daughter who needs it to be good and who is by any available evidence better at deciding things than most people I have met. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, you are going to have to find a way to separate that from the rest of what you do. He said, I know. She said, I mean that completely, not approximately. The building has to be clean. What happens in it has to be clean. If it is not clean, I cannot be part of it. He said, I understand. She said, I am going to need you to prove it over time. Not tonight, not with a promise, over time. He said, that is fair. She said, all right then. She picked up her coffee. She said, the 4th Ward will need more than one building eventually. He said, I know. She said, we should talk about that. He said, yes, we should. 6 months later, the building 2 doors down opened its doors. Sarah handled the interior herself with help from 3 women she recruited from the neighborhood. Women who had been here longer than she had and who knew what a space needed to feel safe to a child. She put books on the shelves and panels that were the right height and lights that were warm rather than institutional, and a wall along the back that she painted herself over 2 weekends in a deep specific shade of green that matched the exterior of the flower shop. She did not explain the connection to anyone. She did not need to. Maisie spent 3 hours a week there helping the younger children with reading. This had been Maisie's idea presented as a statement rather than a request. Sarah had said, "You are 7 years old." Maisie had said, "I know how to read very well for my age." Sarah had said, "That is true." Maisie had said so. That had been the end of that. On the Tuesday evenings when Vincent came to Meridian Lane, he and Sarah sat in the back room of the shop with coffee and talked about the program and the cases that were moving through the courts and the things that needed doing, and sometimes about other things entirely about the city and its history and the ways that things could be built to last if you were careful about the foundation. One evening in July, warm enough that the back door was open to the alley, and the evening air moved through the shop smelling of summer, and the river somewhere beyond the buildings, Maisie came downstairs in her pajamas and stood in the doorway. She looked at her mother. She looked at Vincent. She said, "Are you going to stay?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Sarah looked at her daughter. Vincent looked at the small girl in the doorway with her hair in braids and the expression on her face that was not childlike in its directness, the expression of someone asking a real question and ready to receive a real answer. He looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he looked at Maisie and he said, "I am already here." Maisie considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything worth considering. She said, "Okay." She went back upstairs. The summer night moved through the open door. Sarah picked up her coffee and held it in both hands the way she always did. She looked at the door where Maisie had been standing, and then she looked at the man across the table from her. She said, "She is going to want a real answer eventually." He said, "I know." She said, "I am going to want one too." He said, "I know that too." She said, "Take your time." He said, "I have been taking my time for 30 years. She said, "I know. I am saying you do not have to anymore." The lamp on the shelf threw its quiet light across the back room, and the flowers in their buckets breathed their slow vegetable breath, and the city went on outside doing what cities do, pressing and moving and carrying its millions of small and enormous lives forward into whatever came next. Sarah Whitfield sat in the shop she had built on the street her husband had loved with Thomas's work finally in its proper place in the world, and her daughter asleep upstairs, and the knowledge that she had carried every impossible thing she had been handed and had set each one down exactly where it needed to go. She had not done it the way she had planned. She had done it the way it needed to be done, which turned out to be a different thing, and the difference had required her to trust in ways she had not anticipated and accept help she had not known how to ask for, and revise in real time the understanding of what she was capable of, which turned out to be more than she had known. On the shelf above the window in a plain wooden frame she had bought at the hardware store 3 doors down, a piece of paper hung between 2 small photographs. The photographs were Thomas on the left, Maisie on the right, both of them laughing, both caught in the particular unself-conscious joy of a moment before the camera was expected. The paper in the middle was a drawing in wax crayon, a woman standing in a garden of flowers, sunlight coming in from the left, a man in a dark suit standing beside her, and a small girl in a gray coat at the edge of the picture turned slightly toward both of them with the specific look on her crayon face that Maisie always drew when she was drawing something she believed in. On the bottom of the page, in the careful, practiced letters of a child who had been learning to write her name for 2 years and had recently decided that the name should be accompanied by a complete sentence, Maisie had written, "This is us now." Sarah had found it on the shelf one morning without knowing when it had been placed there. She had looked at it for a long time, but it was not the drawing that undid her. It was the thing she had found 3 weeks earlier tucked inside the back of the envelope, behind Thomas's 2 pages of careful documentation, a small folded sheet she had somehow missed in the urgency of that night on the floor of the wrecked shop. Thomas's handwriting, not the careful documentation handwriting of a man building a case. Something else. Something written quickly as if against time, as if in the knowledge that time might not extend as far as hoped. If you are reading this, you made it. I always knew you would. I am sorry I could not stay to see it. Take care of our girl. She has your courage. She always will. Sarah had sat down slowly when she read it. She had sat on the floor behind the counter in the same place she had sat 3 years earlier, on a different kind of floor with a different kind of knowledge, and she had held the paper in both hands. She had not cried in the hospital after Thomas died. She had not cried in the months after, when the loneliness of the apartment was total and Maisie was asleep and there was no one to hear it. She had not cried on the floor of the rec shop or in the back of the Kent or at the canal or in the coffee shop on Wabash. She cried now. She sat on the floor behind the counter of her rebuilt shop on Meridian Lane, surrounded by the smell of flowers and earth and the clean particular scent of a place that has been restored to what it was always meant to be. And she cried the way you cry when you have been given permission, when the person who knew you best has reached forward through the distance of everything and told you that it is finished, that you can put it down, that the fight is over and you won. She cried until she was done. Then she folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then she stood up, straightened her apron, and went to open the shop. Outside, Meridian Lane was just beginning its morning. The newsstand on the corner being opened by the same old man who had been opening it every morning for as long as she had lived on this street. A delivery truck backing into position. The first light of the day pressing in from the east, thin and cold, and without apology, the way Chicago light came in winter. She unlocked the front door. She turned the sign. She went back to work.